Hello, welcome to Telesur. I'm Carla Gonzalez. This is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, we'll look at the Women's Day protest on March 8th in Ecuador. What is the current context for women in the country? How is violence affecting our society, not just as a social issue, but also an economic damage? And how can society help amend and overcome hundreds of years of discrimination? For that, we have Gabriela Montalvo, a specialist on feminist economy. But first, let's take a look at a video on this topic.
Several feminist organizations in Ecuador are speaking out about the alarming situation of violence faced by women in the country. They say that the government is indifferent to this issue and that it owes many answers on issues such as the decriminalization of abortion and the reduction of the budget to implement laws that protect women, girls, and adolescents.
The
state is accomplice of the rapist because it follows the guidelines of misogynist movements that say how to react. Women are asking for compliance with the laws and for resources be used to respect those laws. But we don't only want resources, we want something fundamental that the government seems to have forgotten, which is the political will.
The Attorney General's office reports that so far in 2020, 8 femicides have been registered, a figure that is different from what has been reported by women's groups, who said that 18 women have been murdered since the beginning of the year.
One of the last cases talks about suicide and how the police decides how the crimes have to be categorized. And there we have a problem with operators of the protection system that includes the police and the prosecutor's office in the register, because there is no psychological expertise to define in which context they define the crime.
The collectives emphasize that March is the month they remember and pay tribute to women's struggles for the rights, which is why they have conducted several surveys to deepen understanding into issues such as harassment.
5 out of 10 female students have experienced sexual harassment. 6 out of 10 students with diverse sexuality have experienced harassment, and this occurs between peers except when there is abuse of power, where harassment was done by teachers. In the case of female teachers, 4 out of 10 were harassed, which is more than double the number of male colleagues.
Women's groups also invite people to join the mobilizations in the context of the increase in attacks on women's rights, and where they also demand that the state takes responsibility and act in accordance with the Constitution.
So, thank you for joining us, Gabriela. First, tell us what's the importance of March 8th for girls and women in Ecuador.
Bueno, Carla, muchas gracias también por
Thank you very
invitarme.
much for inviting me.
Tú me hablas de la importancia
You
del 8
speak
de
of the
marzo.
importance of March
Yo creo
8th.
que
I
es,
think
fundamental
that it's
recordar que el
fundamental
8 de
to
marzo se
remember
celebra
that March 8th
es decir, no se celebra, sino que se conmemora,
we commemorate
no solo el
not
Día de la
only
Mujer,
the
como se
Women's
le
Day
conoce
as
ahora,
we know
sino
it
que
nowadays,
inicialmente
but
fue reconocido como el
initially
Día
it was
Internacional de
the
la Mujer
International
Trabajadora.
Day of the
Y
Working
que
Woman,
es una fecha
and it's a
que está
date
pensada
that is
para
thought for
conmemorar,
to recall, to
básicamente dos
commemorate 2
hechos
dates
sangrientos, dos
that are
matanzas
very
terribles que ocurrieron en la ciudad
2
de
assassinations
Nueva
that
York en
happened
distintas fechas,
in New York in different
pero que
dates.
sirve en realidad para
But
recordarnos todo el
what
tiempo
helps
las
us is to recall the
condiciones
conditions
en las
in
que
which
todavía, miles, quizá millones de
thousands and
mujeres
many
trabajan.
millions of women still
Precarias de
work.
trabajo,
These are
condiciones de
awful
informalidad,
conditions,
por lo
conditions
menos de
that
desigualdad.
at least are unequal.
So, tell us more about those conditions, those situations that women are living. There's still a salary gap, a wage gap, meaning that women earn less than men for the same job that they do. Is that still the case in Ecuador?
Bueno, la brecha salarial
Well,
es todavía un
the
asunto
pay
por
gap is
resolver
still something to be
en
solved
todos los países del mundo.
in all of the countries around the world.
En el Ecuador todavía se mantiene
In Ecuador, there is still
superan el 18%.
level that go over 18%.
Es una brecha de todas maneras
And this is a
que
gap
en
that
algunas áreas
in many areas is much softer than in others. So there is this gap that is so strong. It's like 1/5 of the total salary, but there are other gaps that are hidden. There are gaps that have to do with areas that are feminized. This means that they're mostly carried out by women, and others are mostly carried out by men. So women are concentrated in economic activities with less salary, with less public budget allocated to these activities, and less importance, such as teaching and health, where 2/3 of the workers are women. And there are areas that are considered marginalized and of the social sector and never considered as a strategic sector, like mines or oil, construction. So in construction, you only have 6% of women. In mines, which is one of the places with higher salary, there are only 15% of women. So you've got this breach, this gap of 18%, but you also have other gaps that are harder to see, but they're there, marking the difference, and they determine different conditions for men and women.
And do you think this demands, these contradictions in the working place for women, were those part also of the marches that we saw during the weekend? Are women empowered enough to be demanding this, not only respect for life, being equal between men and women, but also demanding that they're respected at work?
Well, I think that in the past years, I think the physical and sexual violence has been so strong, and it's been increasing. It's been urgent of the women's movement. We can say that where all of this is a common point where all of the feminist movements can converge, that women are not hit, they're not violated, they're not killed. And March 8th is a day to reclaim this demand, and I think this is the strongest voice. But I think some years ago, where I began my own movement in the feminist movements, we did believe that the March 8th was stronger, this demand to have equal conditions of work. And that, I think, that has been being left to second and third place after these basic demands. And I do think that it's important to put these topics on the spotlight and to speak once again about the working conditions and the difference in salaries and this division of the sex division of work that later determines the other type of violence. From there is where we start with this cultural difference that determine that women have to occupy these roles and must have these characteristics, and they build this idea of what the feminine should be as opposed to what the masculine side should be. And it's on this basis that later builds other type of violence, and we're forgetting about this. And I also think that the urgency of stopping any type of deaths and violations and abuse, and we're leaving aside the poverty and the indignant situations, and many times even slavery that still happen in our country, and that affect, in many cases, women.
And what has been the coverage in media? I'm very interested to know your opinions on how TV stations, radio stations cover the marches for one part, and the difference in, as you were saying, the difference in the working environment for women and men.
Well, I think that the coverage is centered on the violence on the violence aspect of our march. And there are few media and specialized magazines that speak about the patriotic violence, the violence related to with the economic aspect and with the capacity of women to have the resources they need and the type of consequences this may have. So it's not only that there is a salary difference, so we have to fight for women to earn the same as men, or that there's not enough women in some certain areas. So we have to push girls to go and pioneer these areas too. But it goes beyond this. So we have differences such in the access to credits, not only in the amount, but who gets the chance to have a credit. All type of credits are directed to men. In terms of beneficiaries, the percentage of men is much higher, but the total amount is even higher in percentage that is directed to men than that is given to women. Most of the credit for women is microcredit, and there are other differences, like when the woman is married or in a stable relationship, it's the men who have the credit in a level of over 70%. So you see that it's the men who make the decisions, who has this external presence and has this relationship with the financial and economic aspects. And this marks a difference between the access and the empowerment of each person. So if you have a woman that has less income, probably doesn't even have a job at all, and then there's a relationship of violence, it's harder for them to escape from it. This is also important to see how it affects it affects different women. It's not the same a woman that is in a determined level of income or education than women who don't have the same opportunities, and that they are obligated to choose like maids work, as if this was an election. As if it was efficient, to see where she's going to be more productive, without considering that is the only destiny that many women have here in our country. And housework begins at 12 years, and some even at 6. And although we have a legislation that obligates to have minimum conditions for housework, this doesn't go through in its totality, and it's still a job that is carried out in bad conditions, and many times is a part of discrimination, social discrimination, that just reproduces these hierarchies of different types, like that has to do with the ethnic, with where you come from, and they are reinforced other type of patterns that at the end are determining for home violence.
And now I want to ask you, and I want to analyze a bit with you, this situation about the budget for women to avoid violence against women in Ecuador. How does that affect women, girls, everyone in Ecuador? Because we saw that just recently the government announced that it was going to reduce the amount of the budget used to prevent violence against women, and to eliminate the budget to prevent child pregnancy. So how does that affect the economy, the society, everything for women?
Well, what you say is just a token of how the society values women. it's not only a secondary topic, but also like a marginal topic. So it's always more important to attend to security or investment, infrastructure, mining, or anything else. And then let's go to the social aspects, and at the end, women, and then cultural aspects. So there are several topics that are interrelated. And there are some aspects that are considered unproductive. They're like subsidiary, they're secondary. And that's the reflection of that same sexual division of work, to assume that there is a private sector, there's a sector that produces, that generates income, and there's others that are just considered, that don't produce anything. They're almost stale. And those are all the aspects that have to do with women and children. And with that facility, it is that the budget is eliminated in two topics that are so important, such as the one you mentioned, and leaving at the minimum the budget to prevent violence, and eliminate from the budget these early pregnancy programs. In fact, Ecuador shamefully has the first place in these topics of teenage pregnancy, and it's even more shameful that that happens. Because these are the clues that allow you to continue violence, that allow you to perpetrate the same state of poverty. It's harder than a girl that gets pregnant, or than a teenager that gets pregnant can then have access to education, to jobs. She's basically condemned to a social situation that is poverty and inequality. And this has also a cost and a repercussion to society as a whole. And this should be considered as important. So if we really didn't have any feelings for the little girls that are pregnant, and at least have these considerations that are basic, and they open the door to other types of violence. So we see that the physical and sexual violence is experienced by women of all conditions, always in numbers of over 50%. This becomes even worse in poverty, when it's almost over 75%. So there is a correlation that cannot be denied, and I think it's shameful not to consider it as a priority.
And there's also a fact that perpetrates this type of violence that you were referring to. For example, President of Ecuador saying that women only report harassment when it comes from ugly people. And that's what he said before, and we are analyzing how that gives a message to women in Ecuador saying, well, if something happens to you, there's no way that people will believe you or take you seriously.
Expressions such as those, you've got several all around the world. Unfortunately, the world leaders have specialized in throwing these types of rocks. So it's not only the Ecuadorian president who says that says something so easily, and minimizing the topic of abuse and the real violence that women have to undergo. And it's not only that that it's words; they're also facts, and millions of things that began at 12, 13. You have these type of affirmations that are just said so, I don't even know what word to use, but so carelessly. And what it does, coming from such high levels, is not only allow but to legitimize the violence in the rest of society. So that's the model to follow. That's the leader. He's always the macho, and that ratifies this masculine model. And at least that's pitiful, to say the least. But you also have those things you can read, and women are very keen on knowing where those violence come from. But you have others, like economic measures that seem neutral. Like, for example, tomorrow I increase a tax, I eliminate an organization, or these type of changes that seem technical. But apparently they don't mean any violence. But at the end, they do. Because when you reduce or eliminate budgets for certain activities, particularly those that have to do with social services, education, health, that weight is assumed by women.
When you come in on this feminist economy, and you're an expert in that, can you explain how that relates, how that explains a bit the situation in every country, well, specifically in Ecuador?
Well, what the feminist economy has done for several decades already is to explain, first of all, in the economy itself, but with a clear political aim. This is to explain how the science of economy is not neutral. It's not something that goes after the nature. But it's a social science where there is subjectivity, and these subjectivities do have a slant of gender, and who designs these policies has this slant and translates it into laws. So once you're making fiscal laws or tax laws, you transmit all of it. And this has to do with how you conceive not only the relation men-women, but who you consider the valid economic and political actor. That's why most of the policy is more favorable to businessmen than to farmers. And this man apparently is supposed to be neutral, but it's not. He's white, he's wealthy, and this is how the economic science has been developed and it's been designed, and this is how it's perceived. So what we think is that there is a cost, and whoever is not favored in that that cost goes to somebody else. And when you reduce a budget in all of the social services, that weight goes to the women. If you have measures like to foster jobs, you select construction, because that obviously has a chain that moves other sectors. But as I told you, there's a low participation of women, and at the same time, women have double of unemployment than men. So it's inefficient to attack unemployment. And you're also fostering an activity that reinforces this masculine idea. So at some point, we tried to propose this agenda for the change of the economic matrix. And what we tried to do is we had to show that matrix needed the vision of gender. You cannot launch an agenda without seeing what the effects will be. And no matter how macroeconomic measures are sent, they're not neutral. They will have a different effect on men and women, and on different men and on different women.
So the feminist fight is not only against violence, but also to obtain an economic equality. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we are running out of time, but thank you very much, Gabriela, for being here.
Gracias a ti.
Thank you, Carla.
We were talking to Gabriela Montalvo, a feminist economist, on the Women's Day March, what women are demanding in Ecuador, and how all of us, women and men too, can work towards a more just society, socially and economically. Thank you for watching Interviews from Quito. I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time.